Thank you for letting me come today. My name's Darrin, and I do love a good story. I don't care where I get it, books, movies, TV, plays, talking to people. I love stories. And I love getting to be here because I love libraries. There's nothing better than a whole giganto building full of nothing but books. And movies and records and all the wonderful things that are in libraries. Now, see, I was born before there was an internet.
What?
I know, for I am quite elderly. I lived in a world where you could not throw the Google on something if you needed to know an answer. And so when we wanted to find out anything when we were little, when we were your age, my dad said, I don't know, go to the library. And there was a branch library, I don't know, half a mile from our house. So when we were, 5, 6, 7, we'd get our wagon and walk ourselves to the library. I'm sure the librarian probably groaned when this little group of 6- and 7-year-olds, without any parents or anything, wandered in. But we'd find what we need. When I was in 3rd grade and I got poison ivy for the first time, I didn't know what poison ivy was, and I had it really bad, too. It was everywhere. It was gross. And I wanted to know more about it, so I wouldn't get it again, and my dad said, well, go to the library. So I went. All that to say, you have a library with librarians whose sole purpose to exist is to help you find books, which I think is pretty amazing. So they should be pestered to death with requests for books, and they will work hard to help you find exactly the book you need. But that's neither here nor there at the moment, because I've got some stories for you today. Now, of course, America is a pretty big place, right? Yeah, it's a very big country. It goes on and on and on and on and on. Well, when people started coming over here from Europe a few hundred years ago, they came from a place where people had lived very close together for a very long time.
I'm 6 and a half.
Yeah. And all of a sudden they come to America and fwa! Here they are in this great big place. And so the stories they start telling start getting bigger and bigger. And you know how that is. We often stretch stories out. Say you've been fishing.
To chapter book.
Yeah. To chapter books in our imaginations. You catch a fish, and it's this big, and you're so excited. The next time you tell the story about catching a fish, all of a sudden your fish is this big. And the next time you tell the story, the fish is maybe this big. And the next time you tell the story, it took 20 minutes to get the fish in the boat. And the next time you tell the story, the fish was so big it dragged the boat. Stories get stretched out. Now, when folks first settled over here in America, they came across the Atlantic Ocean, so they settled along the Atlantic Ocean near Massachusetts and Virginia and New York and places like that. So a lot of the first stories they told were stories about sailors and people in boats. Now this story starts with the hurricane of 1826. A fearsome, mighty, and powerful storm. A storm that rolled into the Massachusetts coast with so much force that when it hit Cape Cod, many of you may or may not know what Cape Cod looks like. It's a little finger of land that sticks off the coast of Massachusetts like this. Before the hurricane of 1826, it stuck out straight like this. The hurricane hit so hard that it bent the whole cape. The wind blew so strong that people with rich, luxurious, full heads of hair suddenly found themselves with none at all. And other people who had been bald for many, many years suddenly found themselves with thick, luxurious heads of hair. The storm raged and howled, and everybody hunkered down inside their houses and listened to the thunder and the rain and the lightning until finally one last great big wave went and the storm blew itself out. Whew. As the wind died down and the rain stopped, people opened windows. And the people of Cape Cod heard a very strange sound. Nobody could quite place it. It sounded kind of like a whole bunch of unhappy cows. They opened their doors. They started following the sound down toward the beach. And when they got to the beach, there on the sand was the source of the crying. For it was crying because there was a baby. And not one of those cute little tiny babies. No, sirree, this baby was 18 feet long. Nobody'd ever seen a baby like that. They all looked at each other and said, "My word, where do you suppose that baby come from? That's a mighty big baby there. Gracious me, what are we going to do with that thing?" Well, it was a baby. They couldn't just leave it lay on the beach like that. Nobody knew how they would get it back up to town. I mean, that's a big baby. Well, several of the men went up to town, and they got the biggest wagon in Cape Cod. And they hitched up their horses to it and drove it back to the beach. And 20 of the men from town got underneath this big baby. And they drove to town. Now, nobody in Cape Cod had a house big enough to house an 18-foot baby. There was just no room Well, finally, they went to the village church. They scooted all the pews and benches to one side. They put down some blankets, and there they put down the baby. And no sooner had they set down the baby than it set up to crying. Ah! The windows rattled in the building, and people covered their ears. Now, there are lots of reasons babies cry, of course, but what's one of the most important reasons a baby cries?
Because they want his mommy.
Oh, because they want their mommy, or?
Because they have a poopy butt.
Because they are hungry. And this baby was hungry. And, well, one of the men quickly found a baby bottle and held it out, and the women all looked at him. "That ain't never gonna do. Look at the size of that baby. We're gonna have to find something bigger." They went out and they milked cows all over the area. They dumped all the water out of the 50-gallon rain barrels, and they filled them with milk. And boy, did that baby drink milk. And when he was finally done, then it was time to burp him. And you know, you put your baby up and you go, and your baby goes, "Burp." Well, that wasn't going to work with this baby. No, so they sat him up, and 10 of the men from town started smacking him on the back. And boy, when that baby let loose, it knocked the windows right out. Now, it is true that right after this, the women of the town realized there was another great need, which was, in fact, that they needed diapers for this baby. They realized that there were impending disasters that could come upon them at any moment. And you know, Huggies does not make a diaper that size. But they were looking out the windows, and one of the ladies saw those great big tall ships in the harbor with their great big gigantic sails, and she thought, well, now, that'll just do nicely, won't it? So all the ships in the harbor lost their sails to become diapers for that great big baby. The women of the town took over the sail lofts where the sails were made so that they could start sewing great big shirts and pants for the little baby. And then they realized, of course, that if this baby was going to stick around, it needed a name. One of the little old ladies, she said, well, now, you know, there was just quite a storm that came through, and, well, now it's blown along. We could call him Storm Along. Oh, and the count agreed that, Stormalong would make an excellent last name for the baby. One of the little boys in town, he said, I think we should name him Alfred. I'm particularly partial to the name Alfred. I wish my parents had named me Alfred. I'm sure most of you boys wish you had been named Alfred, don't you? Oh. Well, it was agreed upon. The baby's name was Alfred Bulltop Stormalong. And boy, did that child, well, he certainly had a loving family. The entire community of Cape Cod. And it took a family that big to keep a baby like that in milk and diapers and clothes and food as he grew up. And that baby grew and grew and grew and grew. Until when he was 12 years old, he was 36 feet tall. 36 feet at 12. So he weren't near done growing yet, you can suppose. Why, there wasn't a place in town that could really fit him at all. When he went to school, he couldn't get into the schoolhouse, so he had to sit outside the window and just kind of tried to get his head peeked in as best he could to listen to the lesson. Finally, when he was 12, he decided that there simply was not room in Cape Cod for him anymore. He had outgrown it considerably. So his friends said, well, you should go to Boston. It's the big city. So he packed up his few things, and with his very long legs, it didn't take him very long to walk to Boston. And when he got there, and he saw the great big ships in the harbor, he thought, this is where I'm meant to be. I'm meant to be a sailor. So he signed up on the first ship that would take him, the Lady of the Sea. He certainly didn't look 12, so nobody asked him how old he was. And they headed off to sea. Stormalong was a terrific sailor. Where all of the other sailors had to climb up the masts and stretch out to work on the sails, well, Stormalong could just reach right up and work on them. It saved a lot of effort. And why, he could get back and forth across the ships in 2 steps. Now, one sunny afternoon, they were just off the coast of Nova Scotia in the Lady of the Sea. It was a glorious day. The wind was blowing fine. The sails were flapping a little bit. And the sailors were done with their work, so they were playing music. One of the sailors had a fiddle going. Another one was playing his accordion. And the sailors were dancing a hornpipe, kind of a I'm very graceful. Well, one of the sailors was not particularly graceful, and he tripped, and he fell into the lever for the anchor. And the anchor in the anchor chain went... Well, they were in a deep part of the ocean. They didn't figure it would hurt anything. They'd wind it back up. But all of a sudden, the boat went crunch! It stopped moving. The sails were still full of wind, and she was straining at the anchor, but the ship wasn't going anywhere. What could have happened? Why, we're in the deep part of the ocean. There's no way that anchor could have hit the bottom. Why are we stuck? Stormalong said, I'll check it out, Captain. Don't worry. And he dove over the edge of the ship. All the sailors ran to the rail to watch. 30 seconds went by. A minute went by. They were starting to get worried. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes? Well, they were sure their gigantic friend was a goner now. Half an hour and no Stormalong. They began planning his funeral. 45 minutes. They were all crying great big tears because they loved this guy. After an hour, all of a sudden the ship started to move again. And there, a moment later, up jumped Stormalong onto the deck. The men wiped their eyes and they started to cheer, and they all hugged his great big legs. And then the captain said, what happened, Stormy? How'd we get free? Oh, Captain, it wasn't that big a deal. When that anchor dropped, there was a giant octopus. And he thought that anchor would be fun to play with. So he grabbed onto the anchor with 4 of his legs, and he grabbed onto the bottom of the ocean with 4 of his legs. And I went down to pull on the anchor, and he pulled back. I pulled, and he pulled. And I was pulling as hard as I could. He had a hold of some big rocks at the bottom of the ocean, and I was afraid if I pulled too hard, we'd rip it right up and put a hole in the bottom, and all the water would drain out. So I came up with another solution. I swam down underneath the octopus, and I tickled him. They're very, very ticklish creatures. And when it let go, I tied all 8 of its legs in double knots. It should take them about a month to get untangled. And off they went. And that first cruise on board a ship was the best thing he could have imagined. But it still wasn't perfect, because he was far, far bigger than the ship. When it came to sleeping at night, he couldn't go down underneath the decks where all the other sailors slept in their little hammocks. He had to sleep up on top of the ship, and his arms and his legs stuck out over the sides, and it was not very comfortable. When it came to eating supper, why, the bowls that they served the fish soup in were just about this big, and it takes an awful lot of bowls of soup to fill somebody up at that rate. Stormalong realized if he was going to really sail, he needed a ship that suited him. He needed a ship that was his size. So when they got back to Boston, he had a ship built for himself. He called her the Courser. And the Courser was the biggest, strongest, fastest sailing ship that ever was built. The deck was so very, very long that it just kept right on going all the way. It took the sailors 3 hours to walk from one end of the ship to the other. Now, it didn't take them long to realize that this was not going to work out. It wasn't practical to spend all day walking back and forth. They wouldn't get any work done. So they had stables built at each end of the ship, and they kept 24 horses on board, just so the sailors could ride back and forth. The masts on the ship. The masts were so very, very tall, you could almost see the top of them on clear days. And they put special hinges on the masts so that they could fold them down when the moon passed overhead. Because if they didn't, why, the very top sail is called a moonraker. Because if they didn't knock the sail down a little bit, it would scrape the bottom of the moon. Now, sometimes when the cook was running low on cheese, they would, in fact, leave the sail up. And then they would scrape some cheese off of the moon. That's why, if you look at the moon, it's so full of all those craters and holes and things. It's from where Stormalong kept getting extra cheese for his men. Now, one afternoon, the Courser was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, right over the deepest part. The water is 2 or 3 miles deep there. And she was skimming along with the wind fast as you can imagine. Stormalong was at the gigantic wheel with the wind blowing in his hair. It was a good, good day. When all of a sudden, the lookout way up in the crow's nest called out, "Something's in the water ahead!" And sure enough, the water in front of the Courser started to bubble and foam and boil and move. And up out of the water in front of the bow came 12 long, scaly, sharp-pointed tentacles. And they gripped the bow of the ship. And all of a sudden, she stopped moving, and the sailors went, "Whoa!" 7 sailors fell overboard and had to be fished out with poles. And they watched as those great big tentacles crept over the sides of the ship and began to try to pull the ship down. For in fact, it had been attacked by the Kraken. The evil, awful, fearsome, ancient monster of the ocean. No one had ever described the Kraken accurately because no one had ever survived an encounter with it. And Stormalong took one look at those tentacles and he said, "Oh, no, you don't. This is my ship and no Kraken is going to get it." He dove overboard and he started to fight with the monster. He grabbed onto those tentacles and he heard, and one tentacle took him and went, "Fwah!" Head over heels, over heels, over heels. He spun over the ship, did a swan dive into the water on the other side, and grabbed another tentacle. And they fought, and the poor sailors up on deck were holding on. Plenty of them were very, very seasick that afternoon. For an hour and a half, he fought with that monster. Until finally, in a tremendous rush of foam and sea spray, the tentacles let go. The monster slipped back under the water and was gone. And Stormalong jumped back up on the deck, mad as mad could be. It got away. I can't believe I let the Kraken escape. He beat me. No sailor worth his salt would let a Kraken escape them. I must not be meant to be a sailor after all. It's no good. I'm going ashore. I'm going to become a farmer. So he turned his ship around and he sailed for home. He said goodbye to his sailors. He picked up an oar from one of the boats and he said, "Farewell, I'm off to the west to farm." And they said, why do you have an oar? "Because I'll know that I'm far enough west when somebody asks me what this thing is." So he started walking. Now, with legs that long, it didn't take him long to cross the Allegheny Mountains and come down toward Pittsburgh. And at Pittsburgh, a man said, "Mister, what are you doing carrying that there oar? You're a long ways from the ocean." Not far enough, clearly. He crossed into Ohio, where a farmer said, "Say, mister, an oar isn't going to do you much good out here." Not far enough. He crossed Indiana and Illinois, where an old woman said, "Oh my goodness, I haven't seen one of those since I was a little girl. You've got an oar with you." It took him 2 steps to cross the Mississippi into Iowa, where a man said, Ma, look at this. Here comes somebody carrying an oar like he thinks he can paddle across the prairie." He kept going till he crossed into the Kansas Territory, where finally a man looked at him and said, "Hey, mister, what's that thing you're carrying? That's funny looking." "I must be home." He stuck the oar in the ground and set into making himself a farmer. Now, one of the first folks he met there in Kansas was a fellow by the name of Gabe Slade. Now, Gabe was a unique man. He made his living by trading things. He would trade buttons for thread, and thread for seeds, and seeds for salt, and all the things that he needed. That's how he made his living. Now, Gabe, he was a pioneer. There weren't a whole lot of people in Kansas, farmers mostly, and all of them had one problem. There were no cats. Well, you think about it. Cats don't like to travel. How many of you have a cat at home? Any of you? Yeah, I got cats. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to move with your cat. We did. When I was younger, my family moved 3 miles to a new house. We picked up the cat and took it to the new house, set the cat down. Out the back door, she ran the 3 miles back across town to the old house, where she meowed outside the door till somebody let her in, and she went and hid down in the basement. Over and over again, we could not get this cat. Somebody finally said, "Put butter on the cat's paws. She'll lick off the butter and lick off the scent of the old house." It was stupid advice. It didn't work. And the cat developed a lifelong fondness for butter. For the rest of its unnaturally long life, my mom kept taking that cat off the counter and away from the butter. She never did like that cat very much. Well, that's the same way for these pioneers. When you are loading up your covered wagon to go to the west, your dog will say, "Oh, let's go. Come on. I can't wait to go." When your cat sees you loading up the wagon to move west, your cat will say, "Good luck." And as a result, there were no cats at all in Kansas. And one night, Gabe Slade was sitting in his log cabin with his wife, Mrs. Gabe, and she looks at her husband and she says, "Gabe Slade, Do you know what I wish? I wish we had us a cat. You know, a house, it ain't a home without a cat to sit on your lap of an evening and pet you and purr and cuddle. I wish we had us a cat. I do. And Gabe Slade, the mice in this house, oh, yesterday I was cooking and the mice picked me up bodily and carried me out. We need us a cat. I said the same thing to Mrs. McGillicuddy. She said that she wished that she had a cat. Now this gave Gabe an idea. He thought, now if I had cats, think of all the trading that I could do with these cats, man. But where am I going to get me some cats? I could go back to the city. There's stray cats all over the place in the city. It'll be easy. So he hitched up his 2 oxen, a couple of big cows to his cart, and they headed off across the prairie. When he got to the railroad, he got on a train and he bounced across the prairie on the train. When they came to the river, he got on a steamboat. And he went down the river to St. Louis, Missouri. Now at St. Louis, he grabbed a sack and he went out to look for cats. It didn't take long to find him. Here, kitty, 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 here, kitty, hello, little kitty cat. In the sack you go, meow, 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 meow. No cats were harmed in the making of this story. But you know, it wasn't long before he had 28 cats in his bag. What? 28 cats in his bag. And he heads back to the boat. He decanted his cats into a crate. Okay, Captain, let's head for Kansas. So they started back up the river. And everything went just fine until the sun went down. And then the boat stopped. And Gabe said, Captain, what are you doing stopping? We got to keep going. We got to get back to Kansas with my cats. Well, Gabe Slade, we have to wait for a few minutes. I have to wait for the dogs to wake up. Why? Why, because, Gabe Slade, I steer this boat from dog to dog at night. Oh, of course you steer the... What? Oh, Gabe Slade, I know every dog on this river. I know when this dog barks, I turn a little bit this way, and when that dog barks, I go over here. You just wait a minute, they'll wake up. But they weren't. Gabe was getting impatient. He says, Captain, we got to do something. I got cats for Kansas here. They'll expire if we don't get moving. Well, ain't nothing I can do till the dogs wake up. Gabe got an idea. He ran and grabbed a fishing pole. Oh, Gabe Slade, this is no time for fishing. We got to figure out a way to wake up the dogs. Oh, I got an idea, Captain. Don't worry. Oh, I got a bite, too. He pulled in a nice, big, fat carp. And he walked that carp over to the crate full of cats. Now, they hadn't had anything to eat all day, and they was hungry. What does your cat do in the morning when it's hungry? Yeah. Let me hear it. Now, when that racket got set up, what do you suppose the dogs did? What did they sound like? And so, off they headed upriver. Now, when they got to the railroad, Gabe took his crate full of cats, and he put it in a boxcar, and they headed off across the prairie. Gabe went up to the engine to ride with the engineer, and they were bouncing along, having a great time. Gabe blew the whistle once in a while. Woo, woo, woo. Suddenly, the engineer looked out the window. Saints preserve us, Gabe Slade! Oh, no, look up ahead. What is it? Oh, dear. Up ahead of them, on either side of the tracks, were 24 train robbers. 12 on each side. They had a great big thick rope that they had pulled tight across the tracks, ready to knock the engine right off the rails. Gabe Slade, we'll have to stop the train. Woo, woo, we can't get through that. Oh, no, you don't, Captain. We got cats going to Kansas. We're going full speed ahead. And he grabbed the lever and he shoved it as fast as it would go. And the engine went... Woo, woo, they were rocketing down the tracks toward the train robbers, and the train robbers had that rope pulled as tight as they could pull it, and the train was running. Kaboom! And all of a sudden, the air was full of train robbers going, Fwah! Fwah! Ah! And the engine went barreling straight on through. When they came to the end of the line, Gabe got the cats and he put them in his wagon. He hitched up his 2 oxen, and off they went across the prairie together. Now, they had to sleep that night out under the stars. In the morning, Gabe woke up to a terrible shock. One of his oxen had died during the night. I know, there it was, belly up on the ground. What am I going to do? How am I going to get home? It's a 2-ox cart. If I just have 1 ox, it'll just go in circles all the time. I can't pull it that way, and I can't hitch up the cats. No, terribly impractical. I can't do that. Oh, now that's a possibility. There, on a hillside, was a buffalo grazing. And Gabe thought, now, buffalo, that's just a big ox, really. I bet if I could catch it, I could tame it up. So he grabbed his lasso. I got it! Right around the horns. Ah! That buffalo took off. He was dragging him across the prairie. Up hills, down valleys. They came through this creek where a dead tree was. And Gabe wrapped the rope around a tree, and the buffalo went, hark! Hark! Ah! Pulled that tree right up out of the ground. Its top stuck in the dirt. And as the buffalo ran along, that tree just dragged through the dirt, turning up the ground. It ran to this end of the prairie. It turned around. It ran to this end of the prairie, dragging that tree through the dirt. It ran this way. Back and forth like that for 4 hours. And at the end of that time, you know, that buffalo had plowed up about 100 acres of really nice farmland. And when it was done, it was tired. And when it was tired, it was tamed. And Gabe hitched it to his cart. And he went home. And when he got home, he gave his wife the first choice of cats. And she picked out this beautiful little calico cat that sat right in her lap and started to purr. And Gabe went around and he traded cats for all the things he needed for his farm. And that is how Gabe Slade brought cats to Kansas. How he came to own a tame buffalo and 100 acres of well-plowed farmland. Now, when old Stormalong heard that story, he laughed for a week. And he decided that was the kind of farmer he wanted to be. But he didn't know a thing about life in the West. He'd grown up on the ocean. He especially didn't know about the weather. And he was out hunting for a buffalo to use for an ox one day when the clouds started to roll in thick and black. And the lightning flashed across the sky and the thunder rolled over the prairie after it. And right behind it come the rain. And it rained and rained. You know what it's like. And all around him, his field started to fill up. It wasn't looking like a field anymore. It was looking like a lake. He headed back toward his house, and the water came closer and closer to the house. And he grabbed some blankets off the bed, and he went up on the roof. And it wasn't long before he felt the house go, pop. Whoa. 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 The house was floating off down the flood. Oh, now this was good for Gabe. He was a sailor. He knew what to do. He flipped up the bed sheets right up there on the roof and used them for a sail. And he sailed the house all the way down the flood until finally the water dried up and the house came to rest again. Somewhere in the middle of Texas. But the weather wasn't done with him yet. He had no sooner gotten himself dried out and unwaterlogged when the clouds rolled in again. And this time they quickly went from black to dark green. And the wind died. Suddenly it got quiet. And then across the prairie he heard that rushing, roaring sound like a freight train, but there were no trains around there. And he looked up, and coming straight toward him was the most massive tornado he had ever seen in his life. He jumped up on the roof of the house with his blankets, held him up, and as the tornado picked up the house, he steered the tornado, and he steered the house before it as they headed off across Texas, until the tornado finally spit him out over the Gulf of Mexico. And the house plopped down in the water, and Gabe said, "Huh, I guess I'm supposed to be a sailor after all." So he sailed his little house around Florida and back up to Boston. He jumped on the courser, and he never looked back. Now, one afternoon, they had just dropped off cargo off the coast of Ireland, and their next stop was France. They came down around Ireland, and they had to go up through the English Channel to get to France. Now, the English Channel is not very wide. It's only about 20 miles across. Gabe was a little nervous. He didn't know if his ship would fit. They were just coming around the gray cliffs of Dover when all of a sudden the ship went crunch, and it stopped moving. And Stormalong said, "Oh no, she's stuck. Wedged right in between France and England, stuck on those cliffs." Oh, the English were mad. They stood there yelling, "Hey, you, get that boat out of here. We can't have that. The French will come across." And the French were on the other side saying, "Hey, monsieur, get your boat out of here. We don't want all them English people coming across here." Well, Gabe didn't want to lose his boat. He tried to think of how he was going to get it out of there. He needed to make it slippery so it would slide. Well, there was a lot of soap downstairs because he needed a lot of soap to keep clean. So the sailors brought up all the soap, and they started soaping down the sides of the ship, both on the French side and the English side. When they had it good and slicked up, the wind picked up and the ship went, pop! And off she shot. But all the soap she left behind scraping across the cliffs turned him from a dull gray to the most sparkling white you could think of. To this day, you can go by the white cliffs of Dover and see all that soap they left behind and all the foam in the water at the bottom of the cliffs. Well, they dropped off their cargo, and they were heading for home just around the coast of Iceland when the lookout called out, "There's something in the water ahead!" And sure enough, up out of the water came those 12 scaly, pointed tentacles. And they grabbed the bow of the ship, and the ship went crunch. And Stormalong stepped out from behind the wheel, and he said, "Oh, no, you don't. You got away from me once, but you are not getting away this time." And he dived overboard. He grabbed onto those tentacles, and the Kraken tossed and turned and turned. It was a fight, man. But one was no stronger than the other. They fought, and they fought for 3 hours. And Stormalong could see he wasn't going to beat him by strength. And there off the coast of Iceland, he saw the Maelstrom, the great whirlpool off the coast of Iceland. And he steered the ship, and he steered the Kraken toward the whirlpool. And they entered the top of the whirlpool and began to spin. And as they went lower into the whirlpool, they went faster and faster and faster. And I better stop that before I fall over. When they were a little more than halfway down, they were flying, barely able to be seen around the whirlpool. And Gabe steered downward and let go of the Kraken. And down it went to the bottom of the ocean, and that was the last that was seen of it. And he stretched with all of his strength, and he turned the courser upwards. And the force of the whirlpool went shoo, and shot them straight up out of the whirlpool, out of the ocean, and up above the clouds. And as far as I know, that's where he still is to this day, sailing the courser. Now I have one more very short story I want to tell you. I love this story for two reasons. Number one, it's true. I like true stories. Number two, it's about an Iowan, and I like Iowans an awful lot. Now, the story starts just about 103 years ago in 1914. One spring morning, out on a farm outside of Cresco, Iowa, a baby is born. And this baby was an average, normal, everyday baby. Pretty straightforward. His parents now, let me tell you, his parents were normal Norwegian farmers from Cresco. Nice people. They lived on a farm. And their farm was the average size of a normal Iowa farm, 150, 200 acres. They grew corn and beans and oats and pigs and cows and sheep and ducks and all that good stuff. Now, the little boy, his name was Norman. His last name was Borlaug, which is a terrific Norwegian last name. I think it sounds like a villain in a science fiction movie. Oh no, the Borlaug! Run! I don't imagine the children in school teased him about that, though. Now, Norm, he lived on their farm with his parents and with his grandparents. And he spent tons of time with his Grandpa Nels. Grandpa Nels always told him over and over again, Norm, the good things you do for people will be repaid to you in ways you can never imagine. When Norm was 5 and it was time to go to school, well, he was like a lot of us probably. How many of you think going to school is the most important, best, awesomest thing in the world? I liked going to school a lot too. Norm, though, he didn't want to go to school. He wanted to stay at home and help his dad and his grandpa on the farm. And Grandpa Nels, he says, Norm boy, because Grandpa Nels always called him Norm boy. Norm boy, you fill your brain first, and then you can fill your belly later. Which I think is pretty good advice. Fill your brain first, and then you can fill your belly. Well, Norm did. He filled his brain, and the most important thing he learned about was plants. He studied them in high school. He studied plants in college. He got a doctorate in studying plants because he wanted to know all about how they grew. On his farm growing up, why, they had plenty of food. They never went hungry a day in their life because they had all the food they could possibly need. And they didn't have much money ever, but they didn't need it because they had food. But as Norm grew up, he started seeing people who didn't. He ran into folks in the cities who didn't get enough to eat every day, and he thought, this isn't right. One day, the vice president called him, Henry Wallace, who was from Iowa also. And Henry said, Norm, I was just visiting some friends of mine down in Mexico, and do you know, they're working awful hard to grow food, but they can't seem to make it go enough to feed everybody. Can you go and see what you can do to help? So Norm went to see what he could do. Now, folks in Mexico, like folks all over the world, grew lots of wheat. Why, wheat is like the basic Lego block of life. If you can't grow wheat, you can't make bread. You can't make, well, in Mexico, tortillas. Unless you have corn tortillas, and I prefer flour. Anyway. They were trying to grow up, but do you know what would happen? Diseases would come through and kill it all. You'd be out one morning, and your wheat would be tall and blowing in the wind, and America the Beautiful would be playing in the background with amber waves of grain. And then a couple of days later, it would all be broken over, brown and dead from disease. And Norm went down and he started studying. He said, this kind of plant gets this disease. I wonder if there's a wheat plant that doesn't get this disease. There are thousands of kinds of wheat in the world. So he contacted people all over the world to send him seeds. And he started growing wheat plants. He grew 1, 12, 200, 1,000, 5,000, 8,000 plants until he found one, and only one, that didn't get sick. And he took the seeds from that And he started growing them and bringing in other plants to cross it with. And he grew thousands and thousands more until he found one that didn't get the disease and that grew tons of wheat. And he sent those seeds out to farmers all across Mexico. And in 2 seasons of growing, they went from not having enough food to having more than they needed. And people around the world started calling Norm. Why, in India, people have been studying food. And they said, you know what? There's not enough food in India. I'm afraid half the people will just die. That's what they said. They said, nothing we can do about it. They'll just die. And Norm said, no, that's not right. I think I can help. So he brought his seeds, and he studied, and he passed those seeds around, and in 2 years, they went from not having enough food to being able to sell their extra food to other countries. Norm, through his work, through the way he taught other people how to do it, through the way he worked with countries all around the world, he saved hundreds of millions of people from starving to death. All because a little boy from Iowa said, say, this is a problem. I should help fix it. That's what Iowans do. They see problems, and instead of saying, well, somebody should do something about that, they say, I probably ought to do something about that. And every single one of us, in some way, has the ability inside to build a better world, to make a difference, and to change the lives of people all over the world. And I hope we'll all follow the example of our Iowans and do that. Well, that's my stories. Thank you for letting me tell them to you. Make sure that you spend a lot of time here in the library finding great books. And make sure that if you get to see your grandparents anytime soon, ask them to tell you stories about the olden days and stories about the silly things that your parents did when they were your age. In the meanwhile, enjoy your summer. Thanks.